Wonderful, wonderful song service this morning. Thank you for leading us in worship together. Thank you to the musicians this morning. I have 4 announcements for you today. The first one is that the tract hanging that we were going to do on the first Saturday of every month. So then in the first time we're going to do it, we're going to push it off for a Saturday. June, we're going to do it on June the 8th. Because there's a lot of people out of town on that first Saturday, including the leader of the effort, Trini, and so we're going to push out 1 week in June, and June only for this at this time. The second one is if you have someone in your family who is going through one of those major transitions, moving from, say, elementary to middle school or middle school to high school or whatever, the graduations, we'd like to know about it because these are important transitions in life, and we'd like to celebrate it. Please let Linda know. Get with Linda, and she'll gather all that information for us. The third thing is we are planning at this time a mission conference for the first weekend in August 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. It will be a little bit different kind of a mission conference because we're going to ask the missionaries to come and present their ministry to us as though we were like a venture capitalist and they were pitching the ministry for investment. We really want to know what they're doing, and we really want to know why we should support them and how we should support them as well. So pray for that. We're going to ask a select group of missionaries to come in and speak to us at that time. And finally, I love all of our young people. They're fantastic. We have like the greatest group of young kids. They play together. They have fun. And we almost let them just run free, right? Just go out there because there's a fence, right? And just let them go out there and play. But the difficulty with that is that there's also another building out there, the Sunday school building, and the kids go in there and play. And I understand why. It's like 250 degrees outside. But the problem with that is they go in there and they make a mess, and then we have to remember to go and check for that mess and clean it up before the next church comes in, and that's a real hassle for somebody. So please, parents, instruct your children not to go into that building, right? It's your responsibility. Just watch them and make sure they don't go in there for right now. Is there anything else? Okay, then I ask you to give your undivided attention to Leanne as she brings to us today the reading of the Word of God.
Good morning. Today's reading is going to come from the book of John, chapter 4. We're going to read verses 1 through 26. When therefore the Lord knew how the Pharisees had heard that Jesus made and baptized more disciples than John, though Jesus himself baptized not but his disciples, he left Judea and departed again into Galilee. And he must needs go through Samaria. Then cometh he to a city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near to the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Now Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being wearied with his journey, sat thus on the well, and it was about the 6th hour. There cometh a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus saith unto her, Give me to drink. For his disciples were gone away into the city to buy meat. Then saith the woman of Samaria unto him, How is it that thou, being a Jew, ask drink of me, which am a woman of Samaria? For the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. Jesus answered and said unto her, If thou knewest the gift of God, and who it is that saith to thee, Give me to drink, thou wouldst have asked him, and he would have given thee living water. The woman saith unto him, Sir, thou hast nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. From whence then hast thou that living water? Art thou greater than our father Jacob, which gave us the well, and drank thereof himself, and his children, and his cattle? Jesus answered her and said unto her, Whoso drinketh of this water shall thirst again. But whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst. But the water that I shall give him shall be in him a well of water springing up into everlasting life. The woman saith unto him, Sir, give me this water, that I thirst not, neither come hither to draw. Jesus saith unto her, Go, call thy husband, and come hither. The woman answered and said, I have no husband. Jesus said unto her, Thou hast well said, I have no husband, for thou hast had 5 husbands, and he whom thou now hast is not thy husband. In that saidst thou truly. The woman saith unto him, Sir, I perceive thou art a prophet. Our fathers worshipped in this mountain, and ye say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. Jesus saith unto her, Woman, believe me, the hour cometh when ye shall neither in this mountain nor yet at Jerusalem worship the Father. Ye worship ye know not what. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. But the hour cometh, and now is, when the true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father seeketh such to worship him. God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. The woman saith unto him, I know that the Messiah cometh, which is called Christ. When he is come, he will tell us all things. Jesus saith unto her, I that speak unto thee am he. This is the word of the Lord.
Good song service, like Mike said. Fantastic. We thank you guys, the song leaders that put so much effort into it. For those that don't know, Anna didn't grow up singing these hymns in English, so she's put a tremendous amount of effort in learning them, and we're very appreciative of that. And she's doing a fantastic job, as are Daniel and Anthony. The drums are great. I love them. I wish I could help in some way. The best thing I can do to help them is to stand far away. So this is one of the most timelessly beautiful texts probably in the entire Bible. If you just go by pure textual real estate, right? The Bible is precious real estate. You go and you read any story in the Bible, they're very compressed, they're very short because there's very little space, really. I mean, the Bible's not a large book. It's 1,189 chapters. It's 31,102 verses. I mean, really is a pretty short book. And so anything that takes practically an entire chapter, the writer saw that to be important, right? John saw this incident in the life of Jesus to be very important. And it is very important, I think, too. I agree with John. I think you should agree with John. Jesus is having this conversation with the ultimate outcast. This woman is the ultimate outcast. She was an outcast among outcasts. It's really amazing when you look at any type of social structure. You would think, right, that you'd have the elites, and they look down on everyone else. But then you would think all of us who get looked down on, well, we would all be like, well, we're in all this together. But we all look down on someone else. And the people we look down on, they look down on somebody. And they look down. There's always someone that someone is looking down on. It doesn't matter how low you are, you can always find somebody lower than you. And you get to look down on them. And that's what we do. And this is this woman. So the Samaritans in the book Encounters with Jesus, Tim Keller deals with this, this exact passage, and he points out, summarizes the commentaries and the scholars who have looked into the historicity of this thing, and he basically summarizes. So if you don't know who the Samaritans are, very quickly, so they're basically what we could call a synthetic tribe. The Samaritans weren't a actual tribe of Israel in that they weren't any one of the 12 original tribes. What happened was most of the Jews got taken off into Babylon, captives. We're talking about back in like the time of Daniel. And the few Jews that got left behind, they kind of went into the hills of Samaria, hid out there, and ended up intermarrying with the Canaanites that were still in the land. And they kind of created their own makeshift tribe. And they called them the Samaritans because the area that they were in was Samaria. And they kind of incorporated the religious worship of those people that they interwoven with. And so you ended up with this makeshift or synthetic tribe as in a syncretistic religion, kind of hodgepodge or cobbled together out of Judaism and the Canaanite beliefs. And so the Jews who had been hauled off into Babylon and had maintained their purity. So if you go back and read Daniel and you see how many of the Jews that were taken into captivity, they refused to eat the food. They refused to participate in the worship of idols. They maintained their purity. Well, when they got back to the land and discovered that these Jews that had remained had thrown it away, they were still in the land, but they had thrown it all away in their eyes. Well, they just had no respect for these Samaritans. None whatsoever. Now, there is a common trope in evangelical preaching that says that Jews wouldn't walk through Samaria, that they would walk around it. And so the fact that Jesus walked through Samaria was is impactful. That's actually not true. There's plenty of cases in the New Testament where they're going through Samaria. This is not some exceptional case. The woman wasn't surprised to see Jesus there. Now, they didn't have any dealings with him. So they would go through their country, but they wouldn't talk to him. They wouldn't deal with them very much. So that's what she's surprised about. But the Jews went through Samaria all the time. One scholar calculated that for Jesus to get to where he was going would have been an extra week of walking. So yes, they walked through Samaria. And there are rabbinical literature that talks about walking through Samaria and how Jews should do it. So there was actually instruction on how to do this. Josephus, a first century Jewish historian, documents people walking through Samaria. So this is, I don't know where it got started, this trope that they didn't do this, but it's not true. Jews did go through Samaria, but they didn't have any respect for the Samaritans. They looked down on the Samaritans. The Samaritans were outcasts. But this woman was an outcast among the outcasts. And this is who Jesus has a conversation with. The Jews consider the Samaritans to be, and it's a terribly racist term to use, but it's what they thought. They believed them to be half-breeds. And it's a terrible term. This term has no meaning and should have no place in our conversation. But this is how they looked at them. It's wrong, but that's how they looked at them. Both ethnically and religiously. Now, I find it very meaningful that the gospel writers went out of their way to highlight all such people in the lineage of Jesus. Racists, people who are racist, they are ignorant of their own complex lineage. They think they're pure because they don't know where they come from, right? And they're full of their own imagined pedigree. And so therefore, they look at anyone who doesn't measure up to that supposed imaginary standard that they don't really even possess. And they, have these epithets for them, these slurs, racial slurs against them, and this is kind of how the Jews treated the Samaritans. But the gospel writers go out of their way. In fact, there's only 5 women mentioned by name in the genealogy of Jesus. There's only 5 women. Mary, obviously. But then there's only 4 others. Who are they? Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. They went out of their way to pick out and name the ones with the lowest moral turpitude in the genealogy of Jesus. Jesus understood this woman, and they went out of their way to make that clear. So Jesus chooses to reveal himself as Messiah to the Samaritans, and not just any Samaritan, but consider all the demerits against this woman. First of all, she's a woman. Now, today, that doesn't mean as much. But in the ancient Near East, right, you were already inferior. So if you're a woman, you're already not really full measure stature citizen. Your opinion doesn't have the same weight. You're not allowed to give testimony in a court of law. It doesn't have any. In fact, even like, for instance, the Quran says that in a trial, you need the witness of 2 men. But if you don't have 2 men, then it can be 1 man and 2 women. So basically that tells you Quranic math. Women are worth half a man. So he's speaking to a woman. He's speaking to a woman with a sordid past, right? She's had 5 husbands. This is, even Elizabeth Taylor would have been jealous. And she's living in sordid circumstances. She's had 5 husbands, but now the one she's living with isn't even her husband. Even by today's standards, she would probably be looked at a little askew, and you can imagine 2,000 years ago, in very conservative culture, what everybody thought of this woman. Now, the gospel writers, John, he intimates this in his text, right? Because she's there at noon. That's not when you normally would draw water. You'd go early in the morning to do this. She's obviously not welcome there. So she's an outcast among outcasts. Looking at who he's talking to, understanding her situation, reveals to us truly how great Jesus is. Charlie Chaplin once said that you should judge a man not by how he treats his equals, but how he treats his inferiors. You look at religious leaders, they all treat their equals well. But Jesus treats the inferiors well. He has a tremendous love, compassion, and respect for the lowly and the outcast. In fact, it's unparalleled amongst any religious founders or leaders. He respects them. He's never condescending to them. One of my favorite quotes is by a woman named Dorothy Sayers. She was an author in the same time period as C.S. Lewis. Great writer, one of my favorite writers and favorite female authors. She wrote an essay titled, "Are Women Human?" as a question. And this is what she says about Jesus concerning women. She says, "Perhaps it is no wonder that the women were first at the cradle and last at the cross. They had never known a man like this man. There never has been such another, a prophet and a teacher who never nagged at them, never flattered or coaxed or patronized, who rebuked without querulousness, praised without condescension, who took their questions and arguments seriously, who never mapped out their sphere for them, never urged them to be feminine, or jeered at them for being female, who had no axe to grind and no uneasy male dignity to defend, who took them as he found them and was completely unself-conscious. Nobody could possibly guess from the words and deeds of Jesus that there was anything funny about woman's nature." And when you read through the Gospels, she's right. Jesus took women and children seriously and carved out time in his ministry for them. And that's what he's doing here. He's gone into Samaria, to the land of outcasts, and he's found the outcast of outcasts, and he's going to have a conversation with her. And this conversation is going to culminate in a discussion on worship. So Jesus isn't just going to talk to her sympathize with her. In fact, he doesn't do that at all. He treats her as an adult, as a real person, somebody who God loves, cares about, and believes is endowed with responsibility of being God's image bearer. And so he's going to have a theological discussion with her, a deep theological discussion. And he's going to allow us to see what worship is through the eyes of this woman. And from then on, all believers on all time and all over the world, we're going to have to consider worship through the eyes of this woman. It's a pretty incredible story. So let's talk a little bit about worship. Worship is not something that only the devoutly religious do. And it's not singing, and it's not praying. I know we think of singing as worship, but it's really not. Now, you can sing while you worship, but you can sing and not be worshiping anything or nothing. You should be. So singing and worship are not synonymous. They're not synonymous. So for some Christians, worship sounds like an antiquated, kind of a mystical or transcendental term, right? It's kind of a feely, touchy term. Maybe they even think of animal sacrifice. When you think of the term worship, it'd be the Old Testament, it'd be animal sacrifice, or maybe laying prostrate on the ground, and maybe that, or some type of enraptured, rhythmic, ritualistic chanting is worship. Maybe we have different ideas. What is worship? For most Christians, it's certainly seen as just like an activity, right? It's something that has a start and a stop. It can be programmed. It can be directed by a worship leader. When we might think of the song service as worship, when actually a song service is actually an activity that arises out of worship. It's an activity that worship prompts us to do, as is raising your hands and shouting affirmation. These are not worship in themselves. These are things that worship produces. So it's kind of like thinking, if you think singing is worship, that's kind of like thinking that dinner and a movie is love. They're not. But they are things that come out of love. So singing, praying, praising, these are things that come out of worship. They're not worship themselves. And for most non-believers, if we're talking to non-believers, what they think of worship, well, they have an even lower view of this, right? They generally perceive it to be weak-minded superstition, for instance, an irrational degrading or dehumanizing, abdicating our own autonomy, right? So if you worship something, you're just this superstitious person who has sold away or given away their autonomy, their independence, their self-dignity. And so unbelievers think, well, we don't worship. Those superstitious religious people, they're the ones who worship. They believe they've liberated themselves and they're enlightened and they've gotten away from this. Now, this is monumentally false, patently false. For instance, Jordan Peterson, who's not a believer in any traditional sense of the word, writes in his book, 12 Rules for Life, about worship. He says, talking about human beings, he says, we remain eternally nostalgic for the innocence of childhood, the divine, unconscious being of the animal, and the untouchable cathedral-like old-growth forest. We find respite in such things. We worship them, even if we are self-proclaimed atheistic environmentalists of the most anti-human sort. So he's saying even the most virulent atheists, according to Jordan Peterson, worship. Now, they worship nature and they worship, different things, but they worship. In 2005, a very celebrated postmodernist novelist named David Foster Wallace gave probably one of the most quoted and well-known commencement speeches, at least until the last week. That's probably been surpassed in this last week by Butker, but anyways, up until the last week, he probably had the most well-known commencement speech ever delivered. He gave it in 2005 at Kenyon College. It really is a good speech. It's incomprehensibly mistaken, but it's a great speech. In fact, you can find it everywhere. There's transcripts. It's on YouTube. There's an Audible version. It actually got turned into a hardcover book and published. So it really is a good speech. You should read it. Anyways, it's fascinating to me because it's so right and at the same time so wrong. So right because he really does put his finger on the dilemma of postmodernism, and he was a postmodernist, so he was well versed in it. He really puts his finger on what their problem is, and it's so wrong in that he just completely and tragically, really tragically, fails to find solution. I say tragically because about 3 years or 2 to 3 years after he gave that speech, he killed himself. And when you read the speech knowing what happened, what he did, what happened to him after, you really see the pain and despair coming through that speech. Anyways, he gives a long speech that really mirrors, I don't think he did it intentionally, but it's incredible how close it mirrors the text of John 4 that we've read today. And you'd have to read it. I don't have time to get into it, and we're not analyzing David Foster Wallace, so you have to read it. But it really mirrors this situation with the Samaritan woman. And he gets to the conclusion, is the same exact conclusion that the Samaritan woman came to. He's dealing with all the banal frustrations of life in his speech, and he gets to the very end of it, and his culminating point, the conclusion of what he's saying is this. This is the freedom, he says, I quote, this is the freedom of a real education. What is it? You get to consciously decide what has meaning and what doesn't. You get to decide what to worship. That's brilliant, by the way. Anyways, he continues, in the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there actually is no such thing as atheism. He was an atheist. There is no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what do we worship? The only choice we get. Everybody worships. You only have one choice. What are you going to worship? That's David Foster Wallace. Incredibly insightful. One is that he intuits or he understands what many Christians don't. What is worship? Worship is assigning meaning to something. That's what worship actually is. It is identifying something or setting it in a hierarchy of value. So when you choose that something in your life is more valuable than other things in your life, you're worshiping. That's what worship is. And when you set something as the maximum value, the maximum you know where we get the word worship from? Over time in English it compressed down a more unmanageable way of it was worth-ship. That's what you're doing. You're assigning worth to something. You're saying this thing or this person or this activity or whatever it is, this is the highest value in my life. It sits at the top. Everything else is ordered under it. You assign meaning. And that's worship. And everybody does it. Atheists do it. Believers do it. Children do it. Adults do it. Everybody worships. The question is, what do you worship? And this is what this woman is doing. And as she speaks to Jesus, she begins to understand that ultimately that's what we're talking about in life. Everything that we're discussing, all the philosophy, all the metaphysics, anything we're discussing in life, ultimately we're really discussing one thing. Where do these things fit on our hierarchy of values and what sits at the top? Because whatever's at the top is what you worship. The fact that you put it there is worship itself. So worship is fixing and fixating upon the highest value you can imagine. So everyone looks to a highest value. You can say that you believe in total equality and that nothing holds, but everything holds value. One of the things that I've read before, people will say is that you can always tell what people hold in highest regard, because when their house is burning down, it's what they grab first. So you can say, I don't have any preference. I have 35 cats. I hope you don't have 30, but I have 35 cats, and I have no preference. But when your house is burning down, the one you grab, that's the one you love the most. That's the one you put at the top. And we subordinate everything under. So what do we worship? First, let me tell you, you cannot worship yourself. I don't mean you shouldn't, although you shouldn't. I mean you can't. It's not possible. You cannot worship yourself. You cannot forgive yourself. You cannot love yourself. And you cannot worship yourself. It's just simply impossible. I know we use the terms like that, and they have some type of metaphorical meaning, but they don't have any real meaning. Worshiping yourself would be no different than reaching down, grabbing your shoelaces, and picking yourself up into the air. It's not that you shouldn't do that. It's that you can't do that. You cannot assign the greatest value in your life to be yourself. That is like borrowing money from yourself. You can't. I know people say, "Well, I'm gonna loan myself that money." You cannot loan yourself money. If you could, you'd be a bazillionaire, because you could just run that Ponzi scheme forever, and you'd own a country by now. You cannot loan yourself money. You cannot worship yourself. People who think they worship themselves, they don't. They don't. We all have to worship something else. You might believe you're your own master, but you aren't. You cannot be your own master. You can't. You are forever a servant. Rousseau said, "Man is born free and in chains everywhere." Whatever you hold in highest regard, that's what you worship. And you may think, "Well, I hold myself in highest regard." You really don't. You really don't. In the same speech, David Foster Wallace says this: pretty much anything you worship that doesn't transcend yourself, that isn't greater than you, will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you'll never have enough. Never feel you have enough. If you worship your own body, beauty, and sexual allure, you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally plant you. Worship power, you will end up feeling weak and afraid, and you will need ever more power over others to numb your own fear. Worship your intellect, being seen as smart, you'll end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out. You cannot worship yourself. What you worship must exist outside of you. In the words of Jesus in John 4 and the woman, you cannot draw water from your own well. If you want a water that satisfies, it cannot come from within you. It's going to have to come from somewhere else. You can't worship things. Now, you shouldn't. You can. But that is just silly. You don't even have to be a Christian to know that worshiping a car is mathematically ridiculous. The moment you buy a car, it decreases in value by at least 20%. Why anyone would worship a car is beyond my comprehension. I'll have to confess, I've never been a car guy. I really don't like driving. I don't like vehicles. They're just a pain in the butt. That's all they are. They're a necessary evil. Wish we could. The only thing worse than a car is every other form of transportation. If you think cars are terrible, try a horse. They get a little angry, and then you're sidelined for a month, right? So, next to horses, cars are great. But why anyone, we all worship some stuff. It may be your phone. I mean, if you want to talk about what people are going to go back for in a burning house, nowadays, it's their phone. You'd think they lost their life when they can't find their phone. It's crazy. Worshipping stuff is it really is mindless. Things, you say, what's wrong with this? I mean, other than the obvious. Things don't reciprocate. You understand that worship doesn't really work if it doesn't reciprocate? We'll get to this more in a minute, but this is the point. Things can't reciprocate. When you worship a car, the car doesn't feel anything back towards you. When you worship your phone, I don't care what they program AI to do, it does not love you back. It doesn't. If they ever made AI stupid enough, it might love us back. You need a relationship in your worship. And things aren't a relationship. That's why, ultimately, people who worship things, they're really worshiping people. They're worshiping the celebrity that marketed the car to them. Matthew McConaughey, perhaps. They drive around a Lincoln because they want to think that makes them look like him. Or the genius who designed it, like Edison, like Ford or Shelby or Elon Musk. Maybe if I drive a Tesla, I'll be more like Elon. Or the artist who famously drove it, like, James Dean or Steve McQueen or Ken Miles if you're a little more nerdy. Yeah, I want to be like them. I'm going to drive a car they drove. You're not worshiping the car. You think you are. You think I'm in love with my car. No, you're not. You're in love. You have a bro crush on some race car driver, on some actor. C.S. Lewis wrote a article in the paper regarding equality, but he has an interesting statement on this. He says, where men are forbidden to honor a king, in this case we could say a deity, but where men are forbidden to honor a king, they honor millionaires, athletes, and film stars instead. Even famous prostitutes or gangsters. For spiritual nature, like bodily nature, will be served. If you deny yourself food, you'll gobble up poison. Why do people worship movie stars, rappers, gangsters, millionaires and billionaires? Well, when we kill God, well, then what's left to worship? And we figure out right away you can't worship stuff. You're going to have to worship people because worship has to be relational. You have to have a relationship with it, and you can't have a relationship with inanimate matter. You just can't. And you may not be able to put that into words, but you intuit that almost immediately that worshiping stuff is a dead end. So maybe we take David Foster Wallace's tack, his approach and his speech he gave in that 2005 speech was, he said this. He says the compelling reason for maybe choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing to worship, whether it be Jesus Christ or Allah, Yahweh, or the Wiccan mother goddess, is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. Right? So he says, well, his view is, well, let's just worship something abstractly spiritual. Wouldn't that work? Can't we just worship? I mean, we're Christians. Let's just worship, quote unquote, God. We worship God. Isn't that good? Actually, no, it's not. No, it's not. It doesn't work. Abstract thoughts can't have a relationship with you. It is one of the evidences in the cosmological argument, in the Kalam cosmological argument, that God must be a personal God. He can't be an abstract deity. It can't be some theistic view, right? A force out there made everything. It doesn't work. And we've gone through a lot of this. We won't delve back in. But it doesn't work on many levels. And it doesn't work for worship. You cannot worship an abstract God because, again, there's no relationship there. This is the place the woman found herself in, without any relationship. It's the same place that the Jews found themselves in. You cannot worship the Four Noble Truths because the Four Noble Truths don't care about you. There's only one viable object of worship, and that is a person. It has to be a person. Can't be anything else. Can be an object, can be an abstract principle or abstract entity. It can't be yourself. That doesn't work. It has to be another person. But here's the paradox. We've met a lot of people. None of them are worthy. It has to be a person because only people transcend time, space, and matter. It's the only thing that transcends time, space, and matter is a person. So it has to be a person. It's the only thing that can respond, acknowledge, and reciprocate your worship. And you say, why is this so important? So I've been making this case. You need this relationship. You need it to respond. You need it to what you worship must reciprocate, must respond to you, must acknowledge. Why is that? Because you only have self-esteem if the thing you esteem esteems you. Now, I didn't make that up. That's Tim Keller's oft-repeated phrase, but it's true. You have self-esteem. You find meaning and satisfaction and fulfillment when you value something that values you back. There is no fulfillment in worshiping a movie star who does not know your name. That is a road to empty, hollow despair. And if God is nothing more than some distant entity that you lather praise and worship on and get nothing in return, then you're going to be desperate and frustrated like David Foster Wallace in his speech. You cannot worship noble truths and get anything back from them, and so you're left feeling hollow and empty. How do you know that you matter? You can have this pseudo-spiritual view like, well, it doesn't matter, I just follow Jesus and I'm nothing, I'm a piece of rubbish. You can have that view, but it doesn't work. And it's not how God sees you, and it's not how Jesus sees you. Jesus did not go to this Samaritan woman and say, hey, outcast of outcasts, you're a little piece of rubbish. You're bird poop on the bottom of my sandal. That's how Christians talk when they try to sound spiritual. That's not how God talks about us. He says we're precious and important. And you know why that makes you feel precious and important? Because you care about what he thinks. And because you care about what he thinks and he cares about you, then you have license to care about yourself. That's how we're designed. We're designed to put something at the highest pinnacle of value in our life that esteems us in return. Now, God doesn't worship us, but he esteems us. He values us. He cares about us. He loves us. That's why it matters that it reciprocates. In Vanity Fair a long time ago, Madonna was interviewed, and she said this. She says, I'm struggling with fear. I push past one spell of it, and I discover myself as a special human being. And then I get to another stage, and I think I'm mediocre and uninteresting. And I find a way to get myself out of that, again and again and again. My drive in life is from the horrible fear of being mediocre. That is what always is pushing me. It's always pushing me. Because even though I've become somebody, I still have to prove to myself over and over again that I am somebody. My struggle has never ended, and I don't think it ever will. This is someone who hasn't worshiped something that can reciprocate. You are never going to feel satisfied, fulfilled, complete, loved, as long as you're worshiping things that don't love you, and cannot love you, and will not love you. So the only worship that works is you must worship a person, and it has to be a person that is worthy of worship. There's only one person. Jesus Christ. If you worship anything other than Jesus, it'll eat you alive. Allah, the wicked mother goddess, Four Noble Truths, ethical principles, they don't work. They don't work. This is why we started this whole series talking about the Trinity. The Trinity is critical. It's the foundation, bedrock doctrine of Christianity. You think, well, I worship God. I didn't say worship God. You need to worship Jesus. Because without Jesus, God is just an abstract idea. This is what the Samaritan woman said. She said, our fathers worship on this mountain, and you Jews say you should worship on Jerusalem in that mountain. Who's right? And Jesus basically said, you are technically wrong, but they're only technically right. He says the hour is coming, and the hour is now here, when all the true worshipers are going to worship God in spirit and in truth. It won't be on any mountain. What changed? What was the change that had happened between the Samaritan false worship, between the Jewish technically right worship? What changed in time? Jesus changed. That's the change. The change, why is it that the Jews, even though they were technically right, were fundamentally wrong? Because they were worshiping a God that they had never met. When Jesus comes and talks to this woman, he becomes familiar with her and with us when we read the story. And that familiarity does not breed contempt, as some people have written. It is the very familiarity we have with Jesus in the Gospels that allows us to worship him in truth. People think what we need is this very remote, distant God, kind of like the Greeks had. They're up there and no one really knows. They're kind of like an incognito. They're a mystery. And you just tremble in fear because you have no idea what they're really thinking. And then we would really be moved to worship. No, you wouldn't. That's not worship. That's superstitious fear. It is because Jesus walked on dusty streets and talked to adulterous women and sat and drank out of a well and said, I'm God. Look at the songs that we sang today in the song service. Praising Jesus because of his humanity. It's because we're familiar with him. That's why the Gospels are there, and it's why they're there 4 times. So you can become familiar with Jesus. Know him, understand how he is and how he thinks and what he says. So that when you're worshiping something that is reciprocating and responding to you. Not like, like a spring that you push and it comes back, but as a person. Worship is about a person. And it's about the person of Jesus Christ. What does Paul say? For there is one God and one mediator between God and men, the man, Christ Jesus, who gave himself a ransom for all to be testified in due time. It is that identifiable personness of Jesus Christ that allows us now to truly worship, which never was able to be done in that sense before. It's not what I'm saying. That's what Jesus is saying in the text. The Jews worshipped on Jerusalem. The Samaritans worshipped in Samaria. And he says, but now the time has come where we're going to have true worship. Why? Because he was there. You're going to worship. Wallace was right. You are going to worship. The question is, what are you going to worship? And whether that is going to serve you or eat you. If you put Jesus at the highest point in your life, he becomes your ideal. You make him your maximum. All things looking to him. He'll reciprocate. Hebrews puts it this way. It says, he's not ashamed to call you brother. Right? See, he identified. He brings you in. That's what Jesus does when you worship him. He condescends to us of low estate. We're all outcasts. That's what's so humorous about the Jews looking down on the Samaritans. That's like one flea looking down on another flea because the other flea sucks a little more blood than he does. It's just so silly. And here's Jesus, who's high and mighty and lifted up, looking down on no one. So that's who we worship. And that's what worship is. Let's close with prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we thank you for this loving, astounding self-revelation without which we would have never known you. That in Jesus Christ we have come to know the one true God. Know him personally, familiarly, closely, intimately. Amazing. We stand in awe of your wisdom. Father, we thank you for speaking to us in your word, for speaking to us through the common grace all around us. I ask that as we consider these words, that we would set aside all other things, all other objects and unworthy people that we have set up as ultimate values in our life, and that you would be the ultimate value, the ultimate ideal, that we would look to you and we would be transformed as we gaze on you from glory to glory. I ask these things in the name of our King, of our brother, of our Savior, of our Lord, the name of Jesus. Thank you for being here. I hope to see you next week.